They laughed at her soaked coat and threw her into the rain. Weeks later, she walked back in as the majority shareholder to see how her staff treats customers. Rain tapped against the pavement in a steady rhythm, softening the noise of the city as Isabella Cruz slowed her steps. Her black coat was plain, its fabric worn at the cuffs, her shoes damp from puddles that had gathered along the curb. She stopped in front of the bright windows of Maison Élise, the boutique glowing like a treasure chest against the gray sky. Behind the glass, handbags perched on polished stands, their gold clasps catching the light, their leather smooth and untouchable. People hurried past her with umbrellas, splashing water onto the sidewalk. But Isabella stood still, her gaze fixed on the display. The reflection showed a woman who looked ordinary, her hair pulled back simply, her face calm, though inside her chest there was a flicker of hesitation. She reached for the glass door, the handle cool beneath her fingers, and pushed her way into the boutique. The sudden warmth wrapped around her. The air smelled of leather, perfume, and something faintly sweet, like orchids arranged carefully near the entrance. Soft music floated from hidden speakers, each note designed to soothe, to whisper exclusivity. Her damp shoes squeaked against the polished marble floor, drawing glances from the clerks who stood near the counters. Their eyes swept over her coat, her shoes, her lack of designer logos, and returned to their polished nails with a faint curve of amusement. Isabella ignored them. She let her gaze travel slowly across the rows of handbags in glass cases, the silk scarves folded into perfect squares, the racks of dresses that looked less like clothes and more like art. She walked further in, the soft hum of the store pressing against her ears, each display a world of wealth carefully arranged. A young couple tried on watches, their laughter bright, while a woman in a fur coat handed her credit card to a clerk who bowed slightly, speaking in hushed tones as though every transaction were sacred. Isabella kept her movements quiet, measured, as though she belonged, though the faint, damp trail her shoes left behind betrayed the storm outside. Her hand brushed lightly across a display table, her fingers meeting the smooth, lacquered surface as she paused before a handbag placed under its own glass dome. The bag was white, its leather flawless, its handle wrapped in silk. She tilted her head slightly, studying it, her reflection in the glass merging with the sharp lines of the accessory. For a moment she was transported back to her childhood, her mother returning home after a long day of cleaning houses where such handbags sat unused in closets, her father reminding her gently that respect cost nothing, that worth was not measured by labels. She took a slow breath, steadying herself, and turned toward the counter. A clerk leaned against it, tapping at her phone, then looked up with a smile that faltered quickly into something colder. The space between them filled with silence, the kind that judged, the kind that measured. Isabella said nothing at first. She simply held her gaze on the handbag behind the glass, her dark eyes steady, her posture straight. The rain outside had not followed her into this room, but the storm was not gone. It lingered inside her chest, waiting. The sound of the rain faded as the heavy glass doors closed behind her, leaving Isabella in a world designed to make people feel small if they did not already belong. Light shimmered across marble floors, catching the reflection of chandeliers that dripped like frozen water from the ceiling, and mirrors angled at perfect heights stretched the illusion of space and grandeur. Isabella walked further inside, her coat clinging to her shoulders still damp from the storm, her shoes darkened by water that had seeped in through the seams. She moved carefully, as if she did not want to disturb the perfection of the boutique, though every step announced her presence in a way she could not hide. From behind the counter, two clerks whispered, their voices soft but sharp enough to carry. Their eyes darted toward her, sliding down from her hair to her shoes, then meeting each other in a quick exchange that ended with the curl of a smile. A third clerk straightened, smoothing the front of her tailored blazer as she stepped forward. Her smile at first was broad, the type trained into place by long hours of customer service, but as she looked closer at Isabella, the brightness dimmed. The clerk's gaze lingered on the scuffed leather of Isabella's shoes, the worn thread on her coat sleeve, the simple bag slung over her shoulder. The smile faltered into a polite mask, and then into something sharper. "We're not hiring, dear," she said softly, her tone carrying more weight than the words themselves. The sentence landed in the air like a dismissal, not an invitation. Behind her, laughter rippled from the counter, the other clerks quick to share the joke, though none of them had the courage to voice it aloud. Their chuckles clung to the walls, bouncing off the glass cases and mirrored panels, leaving Isabella standing at the center of attention she had never asked for. Her breath tightened, but she did not let it show. She turned her gaze back to the display case, her eyes fixed on the handbag that had drawn her in from the street. Its pale surface glowed under the lights, its price tag hidden, as if cost were a detail too vulgar to mention. For a moment, she imagined her mother's hands smoothing fabric after long hours of cleaning, her father's steady voice reminding her that dignity was not given by others, it was carried from within. The memory steadied her, though the sting of humiliation pressed at the edges of her composure. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice calm, asking to see the handbag under the glass. The clerk blinked, as if surprised she had spoken, then gave a quick shake of her head. "These pieces are reserved for our serious clients," she said. Her words dipped in honey, but sharpened by condescension. Another ripple of laughter rolled across the counter, a subtle chorus of superiority. Isabella kept her face still, though inside her chest her heart pounded. She stood not as a beggar, but as a woman measuring the cost of silence against the power of restraint, her presence quiet, yet unyielding, her dignity intact, though unseen. Isabella kept her voice calm, as she asked again if she could see the handbag in the glass case, her tone steady, though her hands pressed together tightly at her side. The clerk tilted her head, eyes glinting with something close to amusement, then gave a smirk that widened into a thin smile. "These pieces are for serious clients," she said, the words slow and deliberate, as though explaining something obvious to a child. A pause hung in the air before she added with a shrug, "Maybe try the outlet across town." Laughter fluttered behind her from the counter where the other clerks had gathered, one covering her mouth, as though she could hide her delight in the scene unfolding. Isabella felt the warmth rise in her cheeks, but she refused to lower her gaze. She spoke again, her request firm though still polite, asking to see the handbag as any customer had the right to do. The clerk's smile faded into irritation, her posture stiffening, as if dealing with Isabella's persistence was an insult. She tapped her manicured nails against the counter before glancing toward the entrance. With a small wave of her hand, she gestured toward the security guard stationed near the door. "We have a situation," she announced loudly enough for several customers to turn their heads. The words spread through the boutique like perfume, drawing curious glances from shoppers who paused mid-purchase. The guard began walking over, his shoes echoing across the marble floor, while whispers rose among the clerks. Isabella stood her ground, her body still, though her pulse quickened. The clerk folded her arms, satisfaction curling across her face, as if victory were already hers. "We cannot have people loitering," she said, her voice sharper now, foregoing the pretense of courtesy. "You've been asked to leave." Isabella's throat tightened, but she forced herself to breathe slowly, her father's words echoing in her memory. "Respect costs nothing. Hold your dignity even when others throw theirs away." Yet the eyes on her burned, each pair of glances slicing into her as if she were an intruder in a place where she did not belong. The guard reached her side, his tone neutral but firm as he asked her to step outside. A woman trying on jewelry whispered to her companion, their quiet laughter stinging more than the clerk's words. Isabella's cheeks flushed deeper, the heat of humiliation climbing into her chest. She opened her mouth as if to explain, to insist she had only wanted to see a handbag, but the words caught against the lump in her throat. The guard gestured toward the door, and with the entire boutique watching, she began to walk, each step heavy, her damp shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Behind her, she heard the faint chuckles of the clerks, the smug tone of victory that filled the silence she left behind. The glass doors closed behind her with a dull thud, shutting out the music and perfume and leaving her once more in the cold rain. Water streaked across the windows, where handbags still gleamed, untouchable, mocking. Isabella stood on the sidewalk, cheeks burning, heart pounding, her breath sharp against the cool air, her humiliation complete. Yet, inside her, something stronger than shame began to stir. Rain clung to her lashes as Isabella stood outside the glowing windows, her reflection blurred by streaks of water and glass. Behind her the city hurried past, umbrellas bobbing, taxis splashing puddles onto the curb, voices echoing in fragments. She no longer heard them. The sting of humiliation was raw, but her mind drifted backward, carried by the sight of handbags gleaming untouched behind glass. They pulled her into another time, another place, when she was a girl watching her mother scrub the polished floors of houses far grander than their own. She remembered standing in wide kitchens that smelled of lemon and soap, her mother's hands raw from chemicals, her face calm but her shoulders heavy with exhaustion. In closets larger than their entire apartment, handbags lined the shelves, resting on velvet dustbags, untouched trophies of wealth. Isabella had asked once why anyone needed so many, when her mother carried the same faded purse year after year. Her mother had smiled softly and shaken her head, saying nothing, only pulling her daughter close with a weary arm. Her father's voice came next, steady and low, spoken often at the small wooden table, where they ate meals of rice and beans while the city lights flickered outside their window. "Respect costs nothing," he had said, his eyes warm as he looked at her across the table. "Never let anyone tell you your worth." He had worked long hours driving a delivery truck, his palms calloused, his back bent from lifting boxes heavier than a child should imagine. Yet he never complained, never allowed bitterness to settle in his voice. Instead, he spoke of dignity as though it were a treasure no one could steal, teaching her that their poverty did not make them lesser, that pride lived not in possessions, but in how one carried themselves when the world tried to push them down. Isabella blinked, the rain cooling the fire of shame that still burned across her cheeks. She remembered her father walking her past shops like this one, his steps unhurried, his chin raised. Even when clerks looked at them with suspicion, he would pause sometimes, pointing out the window displays, not with envy but with a curious smile. One day, he told her, "These windows will not intimidate you. You will see them for what they are, glass and fabric and price tags. They will not define you." That memory pressed against her heart now, heavier than the handbag she had been denied. The scent of perfume still lingered faintly on her coat from inside the store, mingling with the sharpness of rain. She felt the sting of humiliation fading, replaced by something steadier, like stone settling into place. She had been pushed out, dismissed, laughed at. Yet the weight of memory reminded her that this was not new. She had watched her parents endure worse and still hold on to their dignity. She straightened her shoulders, wiped the rain from her face, and let the memory of their strength flow into her. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside her, and she would not forget who she was. The rain had soaked into her coat by the time Isabella walked away from the boutique, but she hardly noticed the cold. Her mind was steady, her steps measured, though her heart still carried the sting of laughter and dismissal. They had looked at her and seen nothing but a woman in worn shoes and a damp coat, a shadow not worth their time. What they could not see, what they could never have imagined, was the truth she carried like a hidden blade. Isabella Cruz was not a cleaner searching for work, nor a passerby with misplaced curiosity. She was the founder and CEO of Cruz Capital, an investment firm that had risen quietly over the last 5 years, built with precision and patience until it had become impossible to ignore. Under her leadership, Cruz Capital had acquired stakes in technology startups, real estate projects, and even retail chains. each acquisition deliberate, each success stacked carefully on the one before it. She had learned to move silently in boardrooms, just as she once moved silently in classrooms where others underestimated her, using doubt as cover while she planned her ascent. The irony was not lost on her. Maison Élise, the boutique that had just tossed her aside as if she were invisible, had been on her radar for months. Their quarterly reports whispered of struggle, of declining sales masked by glossy marketing campaigns, of debt piling higher than their customers' heels. Isabella had wanted to see the truth with her own eyes before deciding if they were worth saving. A brand like Maison Élise still held weight, its name whispered in magazines, its logo etched on bags carried down runways. But reputation without revenue was a fragile mask, and Isabella knew better than most how quickly masks could crack. She had walked into that store not as a customer seeking validation, but as a potential buyer considering an investment. She had wanted to know how they treated the people who walked through their doors, because customer service, she believed, was the clearest window into the health of a company's soul. Now she had her answer. They had shown her their arrogance, their blindness, their inability to see value beyond surface appearances. To them, she was a nuisance to be brushed aside, someone unworthy of respect. To her, they were a brand pretending to be untouchable, while quietly bleeding behind the curtains. The thought almost made her laugh, though her lips pressed tightly against the impulse. She had built her firm on identifying cracks in polished walls, and Maison Élise had revealed theirs freely. As she reached the corner, the traffic light casting red across the slick pavement, Isabella lifted her gaze to the towering buildings around her. Somewhere in those glass offices sat men and women who would learn soon enough that the woman dismissed in a rain-soaked coat was the same one whose name appeared on contracts they prayed to sign. Cruz capital was rising, and Isabella had no need to announce herself to be powerful. Power, she knew, worked best when it was hidden, revealed only at the right moment. They thought they had humiliated her, but all they had done was show her exactly why Maison Élise needed saving, and why she would be the one to decide its future. The city stretched wide beneath the glass walls of her office, a glittering map of towers and lights that seemed to pulse with quiet energy. Isabella sat at her desk, the rain still dripping from her coat where she had laid it over the back of her chair. Her assistant had asked if she needed anything, but she had waved her off, preferring the silence. She opened her laptop and pulled up the files she had been reviewing for weeks, the financial reports of Maison Élise, each number a truth disguised by the brand's polished advertisements. Her fingers traced down the columns of figures, her eyes catching on red lines that marked losses quarter after quarter, the quiet bleed of a company too proud to admit it was collapsing under its own weight. Debt mounting, inventory sitting unsold, marketing costs rising faster than revenue, all hidden behind glossy campaigns and glittering storefronts that treated people like her as invisible. She leaned back in her chair, her mind replaying the humiliation of that afternoon, the smirk of the clerk, the laughter, the hot flush of shame across her face as she was escorted out. The memory struck again and again like a drumbeat, but instead of breaking her, it began to harden into resolve. She pressed her fingertips together and whispered softly to the quiet office, "They threw me out. Now they'll let me in, on my terms." The words lingered in the air, sharp and undeniable, as though speaking them had transformed them into a promise. She thought of her father, of the way he had taught her to treat every person with respect, no matter their clothes or their title, and she felt a surge of determination. Maison Élise had failed, not only in its finances, but in its spirit. It had built walls so high that it could not see the people who stood outside, walls that would eventually trap it until it crumbled. Isabella knew she could break those walls, not as a customer seeking permission, but as an owner rewriting the rules. She clicked through more files, studying their shareholder structure, noting the weaknesses in their holdings, the opportunities hidden in debt obligations. Her mind moved quickly, calculating what percentage of shares her firm would need to quietly acquire, how many shell companies she would need to use, how much time it would take before she revealed her hand. Every detail began forming into a plan as steady as a blueprint. She felt the sting of humiliation cooling into something sharper, a blade honed by strategy. The city lights reflected in the glass behind her, her own face layered over the skyline. To the world, she was the rising CEO of Cruz Capital, her name appearing more and more in business magazines, her reputation growing. To Maison Élise, she was nobody, a woman in a damp coat escorted out for daring to ask a question. Soon, they would learn that those two women were the same, and by then it would be too late to undo their mistake. Isabella closed her laptop, her decision firm, her path clear. She would not beg entry again. She would buy it, reshape it, and make them remember the day they tried to throw her away. The following morning, the office felt charged with a quiet energy as Isabella stepped into the conference room where her most trusted team waited. The walls were lined with glass that overlooked the skyline, the long table polished so smooth that it reflected the lights above. Her staff knew her moods well and sensed that today was not one for small talk. She carried herself with calm precision, a stillness that always came before she revealed her vision. One by one they straightened in their chairs, pens poised, laptops open, waiting for her words. Isabella spread the reports of Maison Élise across the table, her eyes sharp as she spoke of the brand's decline, of the arrogance she had witnessed firsthand, and of the opportunity hidden beneath the veneer of luxury. She explained that Maison Élise still held value, not in its numbers, but in its reputation, in the recognition of its name across continents, and in the loyalty of customers who wanted to believe in the brand's promise. What it lacked was direction and humility, two things she could provide. Her voice was steady as she laid out the plan, not a hostile takeover, but a quiet, calculated acquisition, one that would unfold in silence until it was complete. They would not storm the gates. They would slip in unnoticed, precise, surgical, patient. Her head of strategy leaned forward, tapping at a chart, outlining how shell companies could be used to purchase small percentages of stock without raising suspicion. Each entity would look independent, each acquisition small, but together they would form a hidden web, leading back to Cruz Capital. Her legal advisor nodded, already drafting the necessary agreements to ensure her name would remain concealed until the moment of reveal. Her financial officer ran through projections, noting how debt obligations could be leveraged to negotiate better terms once their position was strong enough. Isabella listened carefully, adding her own insights, guiding the conversation like a conductor directing an orchestra. She reminded them that patience was key. Any sudden movement would alert the existing board, and once threatened, they would resist. But if the tide rose slowly, they would not notice until it was too late. Every purchase would be deliberate, every signature hidden behind layers of protection. She outlined the timeline with care, weeks and months broken into quiet milestones, each step a building block toward control. The team left no detail unexamined. They discussed the importance of keeping media speculation quiet, of planting subtle stories in trade journals that spoke of mysterious investors stabilizing Maison Élise's outlook. They considered which existing shareholders might be most willing to sell, which debts could be quietly purchased and repackaged, which suppliers could be approached for favorable agreements once the takeover was revealed. Through it all, Isabella sat calm, her jade pen in hand, making notes that turned into commands. To her, the humiliation she had suffered was no longer a wound, but a weapon, sharpened into focus. They thought her powerless, invisible, but invisibility was the perfect disguise. When she finally showed her hand, Maison Élise would no longer be the one deciding who belonged. She would be the one writing its future, every move already unfolding in her mind, like a chess game nearing checkmate. Weeks passed with a rhythm so quiet that no one outside Isabella's circle could sense the storm building. Shares shifted hands in silence, small percentages bought under different names, shell companies layered like veils, every move too subtle to draw attention. Each time a signature was added to a document, Isabella felt the threads of control tightening, weaving a net around Maison Élise. Her team updated her daily, charts filling with progress, numbers turning in her favor. She never rushed, never allowed excitement to disturb her focus, because patience was the sharpest tool she possessed. By the end of the third week, the financial press began to whisper. A headline appeared in a small column of a business journal, noting that Maison Élise had received fresh investment from unknown parties. Within days, the story spread, larger outlets reporting on the sudden stability of the brand that many had assumed was on the edge of collapse. Words like mysterious benefactor and silent savior filled the articles, speculation running wild about who might be behind the lifeline. Executives at Maison Élise held meetings with renewed optimism, congratulating themselves on attracting fresh capital, telling one another that the brand still had its magic, still drew interest from the wealthy and the powerful. Inside the boutique, the clerks who had once whispered with smugness now stood straighter, eager to serve, their tones softer, their smiles wider, as if sensing the change in the air. Customers returned, drawn by rumors of new campaigns and revived energy, the store once again busy with chatter and clinking glasses of champagne offered to select clients. The staff had no idea that the woman they had dismissed, the one they had laughed at and escorted out into the rain, was now the hidden reason their jobs still existed. Executives gathered in their private dining rooms, glasses of wine raised, toasting the unseen investor who had come to their rescue. They speculated endlessly, guessing at hedge funds, European royalty, or perhaps an old rival eager to enter the luxury market. Each theory grew more dramatic, each toast more confident, but none came close to the truth. The truth sat in Isabella's hands, as she reviewed fresh reports in her office, her eyes steady, as she saw the numbers turning black where they had been bleeding red. She allowed herself a single smile, small and private, not of vanity but of certainty. The humiliation she had endured was no longer a scar but a compass, guiding her to this moment. They had laughed at her, smirked at her shoes, dismissed her presence, and now they toasted her unknowingly, lifting their glasses in gratitude to the same woman they had shoved out the door. The irony was rich, but Isabella did not dwell on it. She had no interest in petty revenge. Her aim was larger. Maison Élise would not only survive under her hand, it would be reshaped, reborn, turned into something that no longer sneered at the people who walked through its doors. As the champagne flowed in boardrooms and boutiques, Isabella prepared for the moment when her silence would end, and her name would rise from the shadows as the one who held the purse strings all along. The sky was clear when Isabella returned to Fifth Avenue, though the memory of the rain that had soaked her weeks before still clung to her mind. She wore the same plain black coat, its sleeves still frayed at the edges, the same shoes polished but no less modest, the same simple bag slung over her shoulder. Pedestrians brushed past her, their eyes fixed on glowing screens or hurried schedules, while the boutique stood as bright and polished as ever, its windows filled with carefully staged displays, meant to lure those who believed beauty was locked behind glass. Isabella paused only for a breath, before pushing the heavy door open, stepping back into the scent of leather and perfume. The music inside floated gently, but the air seemed sharper than she remembered. Behind the counter, the same clerk who had once smirked at her stood flipping through a glossy catalog. Her gaze lifted lazily at first, then sharpened as recognition flickered across her face. Her smile thinned into suspicion, and her eyes narrowed in disdain. She stepped forward, heels clicking on the marble floor, her chin tilted high. "Didn't we ask you to leave before?" she asked, her tone carrying the same sharpness as it had weeks earlier, though beneath it was a trace of unease. Customers nearby looked up, sensing tension, their curiosity awakening. Isabella did not lower her gaze this time. She smiled, not forced, but calm, her expression steady as she folded her hands in front of her. Her voice was soft, deliberate, carrying across the quiet of the boutique with the kind of certainty that silences doubt. "Yes," she said simply, "and today I'd like to see how my staff treats its customers." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, yet the clerk blinked in confusion, unable to process them. A murmur rippled from one end of the boutique to the other, small gasps escaping from customers who glanced at one another in surprise. The other clerks, who had gathered discreetly behind the counter, leaned forward with wide eyes. The manager, alerted by the sudden hush, hurried from the back office, his steps quick, his voice faltering as he greeted her by name. "Miss Cruz," he stammered, his face paling as realization struck. "Welcome back." The clerk's eyes widened, the smirk that had once lived so easily on her lips replaced by shock that drained the color from her face. She looked at Isabella as though seeing her for the first time, though weeks earlier she had dismissed her without a second thought. Customers began whispering, their curiosity now electric, some already reaching for their phones as the scene unfolded. Isabella stood calm, in the center of the storm, her plain coat a quiet reminder of the day she had been cast out. Now she wore it as armor, proof that respect had nothing to do with appearance. She did not raise her voice, nor did she gloat. Her smile remained steady as she repeated her words with quiet certainty. "I would like to see how my staff treats its customers." The confusion deepened, the truth slowly sinking in, and the balance of power shifted without her having to take a single step forward. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through the murmurs, spreading across the boutique as the regional manager appeared from the back, his tie slightly askew, his face tight with nerves. He had been called away from a meeting upstairs, and his expression shifted the moment his eyes landed on Isabella. Shock gave way to urgency, then to forced composure as he stepped quickly toward her, his voice carrying enough weight to silence the room. "Miss Cruz," he said breathlessly, his words formal yet edged with awe, "our new majority shareholder." Gasps rippled through the boutique like a wave breaking against stone. Customers froze mid-step, clerks stared wide-eyed. The soft music suddenly felt like mockery against the heavy silence that followed. The manager extended a hand, but Isabella did not take it immediately. She kept her posture calm, her coat still buttoned, her presence unshaken. Around her, eyes flicked between the woman they had once dismissed and the title now attached to her name, majority shareholder. The weight of it echoed in every corner of the polished space. The clerk who had sneered at her only weeks earlier stood rigid near the counter, her face draining of color until she seemed almost translucent under the boutique's lights. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The memory of her smirk, her laughter, her dismissal, hung in the air for everyone to recall. Now, in the sharp glare of truth, that arrogance crumbled into silence. She gripped the edge of the counter for balance, her eyes darting desperately between the manager and Isabella, searching for escape where none existed. Customers whispered, some leaning closer to companions, others holding their phones lower as though tempted to capture the moment. They had come to shop for handbags and dresses, but what they witnessed was something rarer, the quiet turning of tables, where power revealed itself in the most unexpected form. The woman in the plain coat, the one treated as invisible, had stepped into the room not as a client, but as its owner. Isabella finally let her gaze sweep across the boutique, her eyes pausing on the clerk just long enough for recognition to sting. She did not raise her voice, nor did she allow anger to color her tone. She spoke with the calm authority of someone who knew she no longer needed to fight for respect. It was hers by right. "Thank you for the introduction," she said to the manager, her words deliberate, almost gentle, though the weight behind them left no doubt of her control. "I came today to see how my staff welcomes its customers." The message was clear, cutting deeper than any reprimand could. Every clerk in the room shifted uneasily, their smiles forced, their posture suddenly straighter. The manager nodded quickly, attempting to mask his own discomfort with professional warmth. Isabella let the silence stretch a moment longer, the lesson embedding itself into every watching heart. Then she turned slightly, her expression calm, her voice steady. "Now," she said, "let us begin again." The boutique was silent except for the faint hum of the music playing from hidden speakers, a melody meant to soothe but now sounding fragile against the tension in the air. All eyes were fixed on Isabella as she stood in her plain coat, her presence more commanding than the glittering displays that surrounded her. The regional manager had stepped aside, unsure if he should intervene, sensing that what was about to unfold was bigger than a single store. The clerks shifted nervously, their polished confidence stripped away by the revelation that the woman they had mocked was now the majority shareholder. Isabella let the silence linger, her gaze steady on the clerk who had dismissed her weeks earlier, giving her no place to hide. At last Isabella spoke, her voice calm, each word cutting cleanly through the stillness. She asked the woman to repeat what she had said the last time they had met. The request was simple, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of undeniable authority. The clerk's eyes darted from Isabella to the other staff, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Her hands fidgeted against the fabric of her skirt, her body trembling under the weight of memory. She swallowed hard before stammering, her words fractured and weak. I told you that we weren't hiring, and that maybe you should try the outlet." The words fell flat, broken, stripped of the cruel confidence they once carried. The customers who lingered inside the boutique leaned closer, listening, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort. The scene had turned into a lesson, one they knew would echo beyond these walls. Isabella did not raise her voice, nor did she lash out. She let the woman's own words hang in the air, heavy with shame. When she finally spoke again, her tone was calm, steady, yet filled with undeniable power. "This," she said softly, her eyes never leaving the trembling clerk, "is why customers leave, and why companies fail. Arrogance never sells." The statement struck deeper than any outburst could. It carried the weight of truth, a truth that exposed not just the failure of one clerk, but the weakness of an entire culture that believed appearances mattered more than respect. Isabella did not gloat, did not smile in victory. She simply turned her gaze to the rest of the staff, her eyes sweeping across them like a mirror, forcing them to see themselves through her words. A nervous hush settled, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the awkward clearing of throats. The regional manager lowered his head slightly, his face pale, recognizing the damage that had been done not only to Isabella, but to the reputation of the company itself. Isabella straightened, her voice carrying once more, clear and unwavering. "Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated with dignity," she said. "Not judged by their shoes or their coat, but welcomed as the reason this store exists at all." The clerk's eyes brimmed with tears, her arrogance shattered, while the others stood frozen, absorbing the lesson. Isabella had spoken not just as an owner, but as a leader, reshaping the future of the brand with words sharper than steel. The boardroom was a world away from the boutique, yet the same tension filled the air. The long polished table gleamed under the lights, glasses of water placed carefully in front of each chair, papers stacked neatly, though few dared to touch them. Isabella sat at the head, her posture straight, her eyes sharp, her plain black coat replaced by a tailored suit that reflected her authority. Around her, the executives of Maison Élise shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another in low voices as though their doubt could be hidden. They had seen her name on the contracts, they had welcomed her capital, but they had not expected her to use her position to challenge the very culture that had defined them. Isabella leaned forward, her jade pen in hand, and began to speak. She laid out her vision with clarity, her words precise. "Luxury," she said, "was not about shutting people out, but about making them feel part of something rare, something beautiful. It could no longer be a fortress of arrogance where clerks mocked those they judged unworthy. It had to be a place where every person, no matter their shoes or their accent, felt respected. She spoke of democratizing luxury, of rewriting policies, of training staff not just to sell, but to serve with dignity. Her voice remained calm, yet it carried the kind of weight that made even the most skeptical pause. Still, resistance flared. One executive cleared his throat, his tone dripping with disdain as he argued that exclusivity was the very essence of their brand, that making luxury accessible would dilute its value. Another leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, insisting that their wealthy clientele expected to be set apart from the ordinary. A third suggested that Isabella's ideas sounded more like charity than strategy. Murmurs of agreement circled the table, the old guard clinging to their narrow vision, afraid of what change might strip from them. Isabella listened, her expression unreadable, allowing them to voice every excuse, every fear. When the last objection faded into silence, she set down her pen and spoke again, her tone colder now, sharper. She reminded them that she was not just an investor, but the majority shareholder, that without her capital the company would collapse under its debt, that their jobs, their bonuses, even their carefully polished titles depended on her decision to stay or to walk away. Her words cut through the room like a blade. If you cannot adapt, I will pull my funding, and Maison Élise will fold within the year, she said. You may choose pride, or you may choose survival. But understand this, change begins now. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of someone shifting nervously in their chair. Faces that had been stiff with resistance softened into reluctant acceptance. One by one, nods appeared around the table, slow at first, then more certain as the reality settled. Isabella's threat was not bluster, it was truth, and they knew it. She picked up her pen again, tapping it lightly against her notes. Then let us begin, she said. And with that, the restructuring of Maison Élise was set in motion, not with fanfare, but with resolve. Months passed, and the once brittle walls of Maison Élise began to soften under Isabella's vision. What had been a company, clinging to its old pride, slowly turned into a brand that breathed again. Training programs were launched across every store, not optional but mandatory, designed to rebuild the culture from the ground up. Clerks who once measured customers by their shoes or coats now learned that every person deserved the same smile, the same courtesy, the same attention to detail. Isabella visited the sessions herself at times, standing quietly in the back, watching as staff role-played greetings, practiced listening, and repeated her words as a mantra: respect costs nothing. Arrogance sells nothing. At first, there was resistance, but soon even the most skeptical clerks began to notice the difference in the faces of those they served. Customers lingered longer, left with lighter steps, returned not just for handbags or scarves, but for the warmth of being seen. Marketing campaigns shifted just as boldly. Instead of glossy ads featuring only the same narrow vision of beauty, Maison Élise began showcasing clients from every background, every shape, every shade, each image alive with authenticity. A young mother, balancing her child on her hip, wore a silk dress with grace. An older man carried a leather briefcase with pride. A group of students in modest outfits laughed together, under the tagline, "Luxury belongs to those who believe in themselves." Magazines picked up the story, praising the shift as daring and fresh, noting how rare it was for a luxury brand to turn its lens outward rather than inward. Sales began to climb, first slowly, then in sharp lines that caught analysts by surprise. Stores that had once felt empty now bustled with energy, not only from wealthy regulars, but from new faces who felt, perhaps for the first time, welcome. Word of mouth spread quickly, carried through conversations, and shared across glowing screens, each post tagged with astonishment at the kindness found behind the polished doors of Maison Élise. The press turned its gaze toward Isabella, writing glowing pieces about the woman who had quietly reshaped a failing empire. Articles praised her as visionary. Headlines declared that she had democratized luxury without sacrificing prestige. Interviews requested her time, but she often declined, letting the results speak louder than her words. When she did appear, she spoke plainly, reminding the world that luxury was not in gold clasps or marble floors, but in the dignity of every exchange, the simple act of respect that turned a transaction into an experience. Within the boutiques themselves, the change was undeniable. Where once there had been whispers of judgment, now there was the sound of laughter, of greetings spoken warmly, of footsteps welcomed rather than measured. Employees carried themselves differently, their pride no longer rooted in exclusivity but in service. For Isabella, the sight of it all was more satisfying than the climbing sales reports or the glowing headlines. Maison Élise was no longer a fortress built on arrogance. It had become a living brand, defined not by who it kept out, but by how it treated those it welcomed in. The boutique glowed brighter than ever on the evening of the gala. Chandeliers spilling golden light across polished marble floors, musicians playing softly near the entrance, while glasses of champagne sparkled in the hands of invited guests. It was a celebration of the brand's rebirth, the unveiling of its new collection under Isabella's leadership, a night meant to mark transformation. Reporters lined the edges with cameras ready, capturing every detail from the floral arrangements to the red carpet rolled out across the front steps. Inside, the air buzzed with expectation, but beneath the glamour there was something else, a quiet recognition that the company had been given a second life. When Isabella arrived, stepping from a simple black car instead of a limousine, the reaction was immediate. Applause rippled through the boutique, spreading like a tide until the entire room seemed to rise in welcome. Guests turned, smiling, clapping, their admiration genuine. She wore an elegant but understated gown, her jewelry minimal, her confidence radiant. The same woman who had once been pushed out into the rain now entered as the reason the lights still shone, the reason Maison Élise had survived. The difference was not in her clothes, but in the recognition etched on every face around her. Near the entrance, standing stiffly with a practiced smile, was the clerk who had once sneered at her, the same one who had mocked her shoes and called for security. Tonight she wore the uniform of a greeter, her position reduced, her authority gone. She bowed her head as Isabella passed, her hands clasped too tightly, the flush of shame rising in her cheeks. There was no malice in Isabella's glance, no gloating smirk, only a calm acknowledgement that the balance had shifted. The humiliation of the past had become the clerk's lesson, a reminder that arrogance carried consequences. Isabella moved through the crowd with grace, speaking to designers, shaking hands with partners, offering small smiles to reporters who asked about her vision. Cameras flashed as she stood beside the new campaign posters, images of clients diverse and radiant. Each photograph a declaration of the brand's new identity. Guests praised the boldness of the shift, the courage it had taken to change direction, and Isabella listened with quiet humility, reminding them that respect was the true luxury they had been missing all along. As the night unfolded, the boutique filled with laughter, music, and conversations in many languages, a living testament to the bridges Isabella had built. Every detail reflected her influence, from the staff trained to welcome with warmth, to the displays arranged not to intimidate, but to invite. For her, the true redemption was not the applause, not the headlines that would follow, but the sight of a brand that had once turned her away, now opening its doors wide to everyone. She raised her glass when the time came for a toast, her words simple yet powerful, reminding all present that arrogance had no place in the future of Maison Élise, only dignity, humility, and vision. The morning of the announcement carried a different kind of anticipation, quieter than a gala but far heavier in meaning. The press gathered in a sunlit hall, cameras aligned in neat rows, their lenses aimed at a stage dressed with nothing more than a podium and a banner, reading the Cruz Initiative for Opportunity. Executives from Maison Élise sat in the front row, their polished shoes lined up like soldiers, but behind them were seats filled with women from community colleges, local organizations, and small businesses. Women who had been invited because this event was for them. Isabella stood backstage for a moment, her hand resting on the jade pen she carried like a talisman, her mind briefly drifting back to her parents, to the long days when survival left no room for dreams. She remembered her mother cleaning other people's houses, her father telling her that dignity was not for sale, and she thought of the clerk who had once sneered at her as though she were invisible. All of it had led here. When she stepped onto the stage, the applause was polite at first, then grew into something warmer. She wore a simple navy suit, her hair pulled back, her presence steady and composed. She began speaking not of profit or expansion, but of memory, of her own journey, of the countless women who worked long hours in silence, their talents hidden because opportunity had never come knocking. Her voice was calm but carried a power that filled the room, the kind that comes when truth is spoken without fear. She unveiled the new foundation with deliberate clarity, describing scholarships that would fund studies in business and design for women from working-class families, programs that would mentor them, internships that would place them inside companies that once seemed unreachable. "Luxury is nothing without humanity," she said, her voice firm, echoing in the hall. "It cannot just be leather and silk behind glass cases. True luxury is the chance to create, to learn, to rise. And no woman should be turned away because of the shoes on her feet or the name missing from her resume." Her words drew quiet nods, then a swell of applause, louder this time, resonant and lasting. Reporters leaned forward, typing furiously, capturing a quote that would soon travel far beyond the hall. She outlined how the foundation would be funded not only through her own capital, but through a portion of Maison Élise's profits, redirecting part of the brand's success toward the people it once ignored. Executives shifted in their seats, some uneasy at first, but they could not deny the glow of the headlines already forming, nor the loyalty that would grow from a company seen as human rather than hollow. For Isabella, it was not about reputation, it was about balance, about honoring the sacrifices of her parents and ensuring that others did not have to fight invisibility alone. When she left the stage, the applause followed her, long and unbroken, not just for the wealth she controlled, but for the bridges she was building. The Cruz Initiative for Opportunity was more than a program, it was a promise, and Isabella knew that this was the legacy she wanted her name to carry. The city glowed beneath the late afternoon sun as Isabella sat in her office, the windows stretching wide to frame towers of steel and glass that seemed to reach forever into the sky. The desk before her was uncluttered, every paper stacked neatly, every pen aligned, a reflection of the discipline that had carried her through years of struggle. At the very center of the desk, however, was something new, a small glass frame that caught the light and drew the eye immediately. Inside it lay a crumpled receipt slip, faintly creased from being handled too roughly, the very slip from the day she had been pushed out of the boutique, her request dismissed with laughter. Once it had burned like a scar, a reminder of humiliation, but now it rested as proof of how far she had come, transformed from wound to weapon, from insult to inspiration. She leaned back in her chair and let her gaze linger on it, remembering the clerk's smirk, the cold dismissal, the sting of being judged by shoes and coat instead of character. Those moments could have broken her, could have hardened her heart or bent her spirit, yet they had instead shaped her resolve. The receipt in the frame was not a trophy of vengeance but a symbol of survival, a reminder that respect was the only true luxury, one that no amount of wealth could ever purchase. It had to be earned, given freely, carried within. Her assistant entered quietly with reports from the foundation, stacks of applications from women across the country seeking scholarships. each one a story of determination and hope. Isabella flipped through a few pages, smiling softly at the letters, at the handwriting that carried dreams too often silenced. She approved them with a signature and set them aside, her heart lighter, knowing that the legacy she was building extended beyond boardrooms and boutiques. Every name on those pages represented a bridge she had once needed herself, and now she could provide it for others. The phone on her desk buzzed with a call from the board, eager for her input on the next international expansion, but she silenced it for a moment, choosing instead to watch the sun slip lower against the skyline. Her mind drifted back to her parents, to her father's voice reminding her that respect costs nothing, to her mother's weary hands scrubbing floors that were never her own. She whispered softly into the quiet room, a promise carried only by the walls and the framed receipt. I made it, and I carried you with me. Outside her office, employees moved with purpose, greeting one another warmly. A culture shifted not by profit alone, but by principle. Inside, Isabella let her fingers rest lightly against the glass frame, the paper within, no longer heavy but light as air. She had turned humiliation into strength, invisibility into presence, pain into legacy. She closed her eyes for a moment, steady and calm, then rose to join the meeting. The receipt remained on her desk, a silent reminder that the truest wealth was not in handbags or titles, but in dignity that could never be bought and never be taken away. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.